Ed Miliband and David Cameron with their weekly joust. Now, do online electronic petitions have their place in a democratic system? Thursday saw the latest Commons debate to be triggered by the government's e-petition process, a system devised and started last year. The debate this time was on the controversial proposal for a mass culling of badgers to control the spread of TB in cattle. 2 trial culls in southwest England have been called off for now. But the Commons debate still went ahead. We'll be looking at some highlights of the debate in a moment and then discuss with 2 politicians whether e-petitions are a sensible idea or not. But first, Henry Tribe has been looking at e-petitions.
So I think we all understand how this government thing works. We vote for our favourite party, they form a government, hopefully, and then they use their majority in the House of Commons to turn bills into law.
Carrying out the process is not.
But with the government bringing forward very little legislation this session, could this be the time for ideas and proposals from backbench MPs to shine? Well, they've always had a German debates to raise issues and can even bring their own bills using the 10-minute rule motion and private members' bills. But as almost any MP who's tried to bring a new bill will tell you, this can be a very frustrating process. Instead, something else seems to be filling the legislation black hole, and, perhaps surprisingly, it's ideas suggested by you. They're called e-petitions and they were introduced last year by former Leader of the House, Sir George Young, who said they would be a megaphone for the public. It's a fairly simple idea. You propose something to be debated in Parliament, and if more than 100,000 people agree and sign the online petition, then it goes to the Backbench Business Committee, who decides if it should be debated by MPs. Seen by some as a gimmick when they were first introduced, e-petitions have become increasingly important to life in the House of Commons and are actually starting to make life pretty awkward for the government, especially when it comes to voting time.
The ayes to the right, 147. The noes to the left, 28.
Yeah! This week it was the turn of badgers to give the coalition a headache when MPs voted to scrap the proposed cull. But this won't be enough to save the badger, as votes on backbench business debates aren't binding on the government. E-petition debates have now been given an extra time slot in Westminster Hall and are being used more and more to fill the legislation void in the House of Commons. So if you want an issue debated and MPs vote in favour of it at the end of the debate, isn't it time the government listened and legislated?
And we'll bring up that subject of raised expectations with 2 MPs in a moment. But first, let's get a flavour of that badger debate in the Commons on Thursday, which ended, as Henry mentioned, in an embarrassing defeat for the government, but a defeat that doesn't have any real effect.
Public opinion overwhelmingly opposes a badger cull, including in those regions where the pilots were to take place. Over 163,000 members of the public have signed the e-petition launched by animal campaigner and Queen guitarist Brian May. I pay tribute to all of them, to Brian himself, to Team Badger and all those individuals who've played a role in mobilising public opposition to the cull.
It goes to the heart of the rural economy. It goes to the heart of farming in this country. I have the honour to represent 2 livestock marts. One in Thirsk is the largest or joint largest fat stock mart in the country. The farmers who produce these animals live in fear of one rogue beast coming into the herd.
And I don't mind saying that sometimes grown men and myself, we've sat round the table and cried. Such is the emotion that these people are facing when they see sometimes whole herds being taken away for slaughter.
There is widespread opposition to the badger cull going ahead from people in rural areas, from farmers who didn't want the cull on their land, and from people across the board. It's totally wrong to say that it's just townies who don't understand the countryside that are opposed to this.
So 1 or 2 moments from Thursday's debate on the now postponed cull of badgers, a debate that was triggered by an e-petition. Well, 2 fine specimens from that debate join us in the week in Parliament studio now. Natasha Engel is a Labour MP who chairs the Backbench Business Committee, and Conservative James Gray serves on the Commons Procedure Committee. Welcome to the Week in Parliament. Natasha Angle, E-Petitions, what's not to like about them? They're a good way of connecting the public with Parliament, aren't they?
They're a great way of connecting the public with Parliament, and there isn't very much not to like about them. They've been a great success in getting lots of people to sign the e-petitions. My only concern is that not every single person who signed an e-petition has had a very good sort of sense of being connected with Parliament, where they don't hear anything back if they sign an e-petition necessarily, and they expect, I think falsely, that once an e-petition reaches that magic 100,000 threshold of signatures, that will trigger a debate, a vote and then a change in the law, and that does not happen, and I think that leaves people deeply frustrated.
I suppose, James Gray, you could say that this is almost a replacement of the traditional representative democracy with direct democracy. I mean, do you see it as being a sort of handover in that sense?
I very strongly do not. No, we have very strong representative democracy in the United Kingdom, and we too are the representatives of 75,000 people or thereabouts, and those people will always be represented through us. So it would be quite wrong if people out there thought that somehow or other, because 100,000 or more of them had signed a petition, that would somehow or other lead to change in government policy. It doesn't. It's their way of raising a matter in the House of Commons, and I very strongly welcome that. It's a great initiative. It's a brilliant new idea, incidentally, of our new Chief Whip, Sir George Young. It was his idea, so I hope he doesn't come to regret it.
Not too many party political points, I've no doubt. But Natasha, what about that business of replacing representative democracy by direct democracy?
Again, it's something that I also feel very strongly about. We had, when a petition reaches 100,000 signatures, it comes to the Backbench Business Committee, and we are supposed to decide whether or not to schedule a debate. And a very good example of this was when the NHS bill was going through Parliament, and an e-petition to stop the NHS bill going through Parliament reached 100,000 signatures. Now, that to me represented exactly what that clash of participatory democracy and representative democracy was all about. And actually we decided not to schedule a debate because there was already a debate happening in Parliament, and MPs were able to raise their concerns with that bill very directly at that time. But I think it did highlight the problem with e-petitions and actually kind of forcing MPs to debate something that has been generated from outside rather than from inside Parliament.
What about this threshold, 100,000? Sounds a bit arbitrary. Do you think it's too high, too low?
I think it's entirely arbitrary, and I think it's actually wrong. I very much welcome the fact that the Backbench Business Committee have been given the opportunity to decide whether or not an e-petition should or should not be debated in the main chamber, or perhaps in Westminster Hall. And it's great there should be a degree of discretion, and that the elected committee, under Natasha's very able leadership, decides which should be debated. And I don't think it matters. Some very good things might only make 10,000. And that's why Andrew Lansley has recently agreed to reply to everything that's raised 10,000 signatures, whereas some very mediocre things may well raise 100,000. So I think that the number doesn't matter, the threshold doesn't matter. What's important is that people out there are able to say, these things matter to us, we want to have a debate in the House of Commons, we want our issues to be raised in the House of Commons, and we want a minister to come along to debate and reply to our concerns. And I think that's a very good improvement in the way the Parliament works.
I suppose there's another danger as well of the public's expectation being raised, and they expect something to happen, and perhaps happen quite quickly, and that, of course, isn't always going to be the case, James Gray.
No, that's absolutely correct. I mean, it's expectation management, and if you say it's 100,000, they get 100,001 votes, signatures, they'll think, gosh, that means that in fact hanging is going to be brought back, and hanging is a rather good example. I'm sure you could easily raise 100,000 signatures to do that, but of course no one in the House of Commons would agree with that. So it is this question of public expectation, and I think we have to change that. I think we have to make it plain to the public that this is a mechanism by which their important issues will be discussed in the House of Commons, and the Minister will come and answer those matters, but actually it won't change government policy at all. And that's an important slip-up, I think, which we made if we brought this in. It was brought in as a government initiative. It's not a government initiative at all. It's a House of Commons initiative, it's a parliamentary initiative, and we shouldn't confuse those two things.
We're obviously being very lukewarm here about e-petitions. Do I get...
No. If that's your idea, no, I think we're both very enthusiastic about...
You like the system changed, then?
There are details that need to be changed, but no, it's a brilliant idea. No, I'm very... It's great.
The area where I am lukewarm is in the way that we're running the system, where, it's back to this idea that it is a missed opportunity. I think this could be a fantastic way of people to engage with Parliament, and we're not enabling them to do so. By signing an e-petition, people should learn something about how Parliament works in order to be able to influence it in a meaningful way. At the moment they don't. It's a very passive mechanism. And
backbenchers debate has been a major introduction in the last few years. Am I right in saying that you are very much happier with the way that system is running?
Yes, that's much better, and I think a vast improvement on what we had last time round. I think it's all about kind of ownership as well. I think when you give backbenchers responsibility for their own debates, you can see, with the Badger Cole debate today, it's an e-petition, but it's a backbench debate. It's massively oversubscribed. People are really passionate about it. It used to be that the Leader of the House decided what topical and general debates there were on a Thursday, and you had, two men and a bit of tumbleweed in the chamber, and everything packed up early. And now, it's absolutely packed and buzzing.
And not much legislation that's going through it, perhaps giving the feeling that Parliament's just becoming a little bit of a debating chamber like the Oxford Union?
Well, very worrying in a sort of way. this week, for example, the House raised at 4:30 on Tuesday afternoon. Quite extraordinary. With one-line whip on Monday and a one-line whip today on the Badger business. Very, very worrying in a sort of way. I suppose as a libertarian, I would say, well, the fewer laws we bring in, the better it would be. But I think you put your finger on a very good point. If Parliament merely became a big, glorified Oxford Union debating chamber with clever people making clever debating points, scoring off each other, it wouldn't have its fundamental purpose there. It is the place where we hold the government to account and where we create legislation and where we scrutinise that legislation. And we mustn't lose sight of that being our basic function.
Natasha Engels, could just sit less, spend more time in your constituency, couldn't you?
Absolutely right, we could do, and that's not why our constituents have elected us to, represent them and their views in Parliament, and as James says, to hold the government to account. I do think it's worrying that the amount of legislation that's going through, it's quite random as well. There doesn't seem to be a very good plan.
The plan was spend months and months and months in House of Lords reform.
I think this is one of the problems of coalition government, where you've got two parties not agreeing when they're in government together.
Let's just round things off with returning to e-petitions. Do you think they'll just fade away and we'll look back in history and say, well, that was a brief interlude, but they never really got going, they never really worked? What do you both feel about that? Mr. Gray first.
Well, I think it's a concern that if we don't find a way of making it plain to people what they're for, and if we don't then make sure that they are handled properly, yes, after a time people will say, well, that was a waste of time. I raised 100,000 signatures and absolutely nothing happened. It was a silly little debate on a quiet Thursday afternoon with a couple of pieces of tumbleweed in the chamber. I won't bother again. So we have to get their expectations right, and then we have to make sure that we listen very sensibly and very carefully to what it is they're saying. So, for example, Badgers this afternoon is a huge, huge public issue. I disagree, actually. I'm rather in favour of the cull, but nonetheless, the fact that there are so many hundreds of thousands of people who are strongly opposed to it is something that we in Parliament ought to be listening to.
Natasha Engel?
I think unless we grab this now and make e-petitions work properly and give them some credibility and make people feel that by signing an e-petition or even a paper petition that actually their voices are heard, and we give them that credibility, then there is a danger that e-petitions will just kind of wither on the vine, and that would be a real shame. So I really hope we can make it work.
We'll see what happens. James Gray and Natasha Engel, thanks very much indeed for joining us on The Week in Parliament. Some thoughts on the e-petition system. Now look at some of the other news around Parliament in the last 7 days. The government